So I was telling you that I was going to come back and do a video about this story about what happened during the Civil War. And this is one of many stories that happened, that there was something called God's Divine Providence that happened during different battles, like the Revolutionary War and later the Civil War in America. And by Divine Providence, even though the enemy outnumbered them, they were able to win the battles. And they prayed to God during battles, and God would intervene. They would kneel on the battlefield, like when they were at camp, and they would pray that God would protect them in the battle. And then God would do these miraculous things that showed that his divine providence was with them, and his hand and heart was to watch over them for success. So we had this incredible story about Elisha, and this was in 2 Kings 6, and it says, and I'll read from the Jewish Tanakh versions, 1917. And the sons of the prophets said unto Elisha, Behold now, the place where we dwelled before thee is too strait for us. Let us go, we pray thee, unto the Jordan, and take thence every man a beam, and let us make us a place there where we may dwell. And he answered, Go ye. And one said, Be content, I pray thee, and go with thy servants. And answered he, I will go. So he went with him. And when they came to the Jordan, they cut down wood. But as one was felling a beam, the axe head fell into the water, and he cried and said, Alas, my master, for it was borrowed. And the man of God said, Where fell it? And he showed him the place. And he cut down a stick and cast it in thither, and made the iron to swim. And he said, Take it up to thee. So he put out his hand and took it. Now the king of Aram warred against Israel, and he took counsel with his servants, saying, In such and such a place shall be my camp. And the man of God sent unto the king of Israel, saying, Beware that thou pass not such a place, for thither the Arameans are coming down. And the king of Israel sent to the place which the man of God told him and warned him of, and he guarded himself there, not once or twice. And the heart of the king of Aram was sore troubled for this thing, and he called his servants and said unto them, Will ye not tell me which of us is for the king of Israel? And one of the servants said, Nay, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet that is in Israel, telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bedchamber. And he said, Go and see where he is, that I may send and fetch him. And it was told him, saying, Behold, he is in Dothan. And therefore sent he thither horses and chariots and a great host. And they came by night and compassed the city about. And when the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth, behold, a host with horses and chariots was round about the city. And his servant said unto him, Alas, my master, how shall we do? And he answered, Fear not, for they that are with us are more than they that are with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. And when they came down to him, Elisha prayed unto the Lord and said, Smite this people, I pray thee, with blindness. And he smote them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. And Elisha said unto them, This is not the way, neither is this the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. And he led them to Samaria. And it came to pass, when they were come into Samaria, that Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. And the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. And the king of Israel said unto Elisha, when he saw them, My father, shall I smite them? Shall I smite them? And he answered, Thou shalt not smite them. Hast thou taken captive with thy sword and with thy bow those whom thou wouldst smite? Set bread and water before them that they may eat and drink and go to their master. And he prepared great provision for them. And when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. And the bands of Aram came no more into the land of Israel. And so there was this heavenly host of God's army with fiery chariots that were surrounding Elisha and his men. And all God had to do was open their eyes to see it. Now, this is kind of like what happens sometimes with revelations that I have seen when I've been researching in my Bible. And the Lord opens my eyes to see something. It's like it was there all along, but he had to open my eyes through the power of the Holy Spirit to see it. So this is one of the coolest stories of divine providence, where God sent his fiery chariots and surrounded Elisha for protection and his men. And the mountain was full of these horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. And so it frightened the enemy and made them react accordingly, so that Elisha prevailed. So during the Civil War, there was this story that happened that gave the men, the soldiers, great hope when they had lost all hope because they were being defeated in battle, in the Civil War battle. So I want to tell you that story. And this reminded me of this incident with Elisha, with these horses and chariots appearing, which turned the tables and turned the tide of what was going to happen. Okay, so here we go. This is the cool story. And this is dated May 15th, 2017. Joshua Chamberlain and the Ghost. The American Civil War was in full rage by 1863. On July 1st, 1863, the armies were massing around a small town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest and crucial in the war. Joshua Chamberlain was the colonel of the 20th Maine, promoted after the Battle of Chancellorsville. The 20th Maine was described as a hell of a regiment, which was not a compliment. Apparently, they were unruly and had some deserters that had to be forced back to duty at the point of a bayonet. I imagine that this was par for the course in those days, however. Chamberlain was told by General Meade to make them do duty or shoot them down the moment they refused. Chamberlain took a softer approach, as many of the deserters were men he knew from home, and they were fed and added back to the ranks. They had orders to head home soon anyway. However, before they could go back to Maine, they received the call to march to Gettysburg double quick, and they booked it to Pennsylvania. But once they got there, it was dark, and this is when things got strange. According to Colonel Chamberlain in his book, Blood and Fire at Gettysburg, the officers reached a fork in the road and wasn't sure which way to go. The account says, "Suddenly the clouds parted, and the moon shone down upon a horseman wearing a bright coat and a tri-cornered hat, mounted on a magnificent pale horse, and he cantered down one of the roads branching off before them. Turning slightly toward them, he waved them to follow. If that's not a sign, I don't know what is. Hundreds of soldiers were said to have seen this man on horseback, and they followed the man on horseback who led them where they needed to be. Many of the officers assumed that this was a Union general. The name General McClellan got bandied about. However, some of the men remarked upon the strong resemblance that the man bore to paintings of George Washington that they had seen. On July 2nd, Chamberlain was ordered to Little Round Top by Union commanders after they realized there were only signalmen guarding the strategic heights. Once again, the 20th Maine hustled, and they only beat the first wave of General Longstreet's Confederates by a few minutes. In any case, the 20th Maine were given the charge to hold Little Round Top at all hazards, and soon they were under heavy artillery fire. The Confederates kept coming, and soon there were outbreaks of deadly hand-to-hand fighting, but the line held. However, it was a close thing, and Colonel Chamberlain worried that the line would not stand another assault, and now there was gunfire behind them as well. There were fears among the exhausted men. The Confederates had them surrounded. They were the last line of defense. If they fell, the battle, and possibly the war and the Union were lost. Here is where things get weird once again. This is Divine Providence, you guys. According to reports from troops after the battle, a tall man on a pale horse rode into their midst. He was in an old-fashioned uniform and tri-cornered hat. Every man on the Union side who saw him felt his courage renewed. The Confederates saw the rider as well and focused fire on the conspicuous target, but the rider never fell. So this man dressed in, like Revolutionary War garb, with a tri-cornered hat like George Washington wore in the Revolution, was riding back and forth in the battle between the two sides, the Union and the Confederates, and the Confederates were shooting at him, but he never fell off his horse, and they were repeatedly shooting at him. He never fell off the horse. So, despite this moral boost, things were looking bleak for the 20th Maine. They were out of ammo and hope. Enter the strange phantom. According to Chamberlain, suddenly an imposing figure stood in front of the line, exhorting them to follow. The rays of the afternoon sun set his upraised sword aflame. The men were filled with hope and bravery and fixed their bayonets and charged into the line of Confederates. The men of the 15th Alabama were shocked at such a bold move and didn't have time to fire a defensive volley. The Confederates were mowed down by the men of the 20th Maine, then caught in a pincer between them and the men of the 83rd Pennsylvania. 400 Confederates were taken prisoner and Little Round Top held. Rumors went wild after the battle about the apparition, and an investigation was conducted, and many eyewitness testimonies were gathered. However, no conclusions were drawn. Chamberlain survived the war and went on to become governor of Maine in 1866. In regard to this strange episode, Chamberlain said, "We know not what mystical power may be possessed by those who are now by vacuing with the dead. I only know the effect, but I dare not explain or deny the cause. I do believe that we were enveloped by the power of the other world that day, and who shall say that Washington was not among the number of those who aided the country that he founded? Who indeed? And these are times that we need to remember these stories, how God protected America in these battles. And he gave the soldiers courage to fight on in the midst of great loss. And it breaks my heart. I get choked up because it breaks my heart to see what people are doing to our country and how these foreigners are coming in and causing trouble. And no one's standing up against it hardly at all. And all of these things by divine providence, God allowed this country to come into being. And it was by his hand that our Constitution was written so that we would have the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and everything that we have protecting us as American citizens. So I want you to remember that he believed that God allowed something to happen mysteriously on the battlefield, and both the Confederates and the Union both saw this figure of George Washington riding in the battle. This is just so much like that story of Elisha, when the heavenly hosts were surrounding Elisha so that they were protected. And this writer showed them which fork of the road to go down so they wouldn't go down the wrong fork and get slaughtered. So this was a fantastic story, and I just wanted to share it with you because I just thought it was so incredible. Now let me tell you something that just happened, that centuries-old bottles of cherries were just unearthed at George Washington's home. The two rare intact bottles, about 250 years old, were discovered by archaeologists working in the Mount Vernon basement. Archaeologist Nick Beard was gently pushing aside the hardened dirt in the basement of George Washington's home at Mount Vernon, Virginia last fall when he spotted the mouth of a glass bottle. Beard worked his trowel a little more and the neck of the bottle emerged. Not that unusual, he thought. Archaeologists find lots of bottle fragments. But as he dug, more of the object appeared. It kept getting larger and larger, he said, and he stuck his finger in the mouth of it to see if he might wiggle the piece loose. And my finger came back wet, he said. I thought about it for a half second longer and said, "Oh my gosh, my finger's wet," he recalled. "I got my flashlight out and shined it in there, and the thing is completely full of liquid," he said. He summoned colleagues and they were stunned. "Here was an out-of-the-box, next-level, spectacular find," said Jason Burrows, Mount Vernon's principal archaeologist. Experts at Mount Vernon said last week that Beard and other archaeologists have now discovered two intact bottles that still had, along with the liquid, some of the cherries they contained when they were buried about 250 years ago. The area of the discovery was believed to have once been a storeroom, Beard said, and much of the liquid could be groundwater that seeped in after the cork seals deteriorated, but pits, stems, sodden cherries, and gooey residue were also present, the experts said. "There are whole, recognizable cherries," said Burrows. "It actually smelled like cherry blossoms when we got to the bottom." Burrows noted two other finds in Virginia of historic intact bottles containing cherries and other fruits, one in 1966 in Williamsburg and the other in 1981 at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello estate outside Charlottesville. "We don't find complete objects or artifacts often ever in archaeology," said Lily Carhart, Mount Vernon's curator of preservation collections. "Usually we're dealing with very tiny fragments where we find even the beginning of something that looks like it might be complete. That is a truly exceptional day for us." The cherries were probably picked at Mount Vernon in the 1770s, perhaps before the Revolutionary War, and stored for the future. The bottles imported from England dated to the mid-1700s and were probably buried between 1758 and 1776, Burrows said. "So it's a time capsule," he said. After the discovery, most of the contents were siphoned from the bottles to help preserve the glass, stored in 15 small containers. "The liquid in the cherries will be analyzed later," said Carhart. At first, the archaeologists wondered if the contents might be remnants of a colonial drink called Cherry Bounce, which was made with brandy, spices, sugar, and cherry juice. George Washington and his wife Martha were fond of it, they said, but Burrows said Cherry Bounce was made in much larger containers, and it is more likely that the cherries they found were preserved in the bottles for later dining. There are 18th century accounts that talk about proper ways of preserving fruits and vegetables, he said, and one of the most common, especially for berries, is to dry them as much as possible. Put them in a dry bottle, cork it, and then bury them. And they would then be preserved for up to a year, he said. The cherries were probably picked, bottled, and stored by some of the hundreds of enslaved people at Mount Vernon, Burroughs said, but they were probably eaten in the main dining room upstairs. The archaeology was part of a larger project to rehabilitate, among other things, the mansion's deteriorated connection to its foundation, officials said. Mount Vernon, George Washington's famous mansion overlooking the Potomac River, is about 20 miles south of Washington. The original house was a modest structure built for his father in 1734. Washington inherited it in 1761 and expanded it dramatically over the decades. Washington, who led American forces during the Revolutionary War and became the nation's first president, was often away from Mount Vernon but loved the site and died there on December 14th. That's my father's birthday, 1799. The story of Washington as a child admitting to his father that he had damaged a cherry tree with a hatchet is a myth invented by an early biographer, according to Mount Vernon. Beard, the project's archaeologist, said he discovered the first bottle back in November, but excavation of that and the discovery of the second bottle did not take place until last month. We wanted to make sure that we would do due diligence when we excavated, Burroughs said, but the weight was nerve-wracking, he said, and we were worried that somebody could step on it. When the day for the excavation came, March 22nd, archaeologists and curators in hard hats and yellow safety vests gathered at the cramped site in the mansion's basement. Using trowels and brushes, they carefully removed the hardened dirt from around the two bottles. We kind of actually all took turns digging them out, Beard, the project archaeologist, recalled. This does not happen very often, and we wanted the whole team to be part of that. He removed the first bottle from the ground. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking, he said, but I put my hands down, went for it, and it came out beautifully. He said he packed it in foam and carried it back to Mount Vernon's archaeology laboratory. It's been a very exciting find, he said, and the archaeologists think that there may be more undiscovered bottles buried nearby. Excavations will continue over the next few weeks. Isn't that amazing? And right at a time when our country is really needing some hope and to remember who we are, where we came from. And I have ancestors that fought in the Revolutionary War, and the story is that they knew Washington, and one of them might have been a spy for him. So I'm not a spy, but I mean, they had scouts and stuff that worked for him, that were Secret Service people. That was like the early Secret Service. So it was really interesting when I went to Mount Vernon one time and parked in the regular parking lot like you do on the one side. But there was one time when we took a boat, small little ship, up the river, the Potomac, and up the back side of the estate of George Washington. And it was so strange because I felt that I had been there before. Somehow I felt a spiritual connection to the place in a very odd way. Not when we parked in the parking lot area that's modern, but coming up the river like they would have done 250 years ago. So my ancestors, some of the information I had found was that they had played games with George Washington and his family at Mount Vernon. So they would play games outside, you know, like, I don't know what they did. They had all kinds of games they played outside, you know, sack races and all of this stuff. So supposedly, you know, they knew him and were friends with him. And then my Revolutionary War ancestor requested to be buried next to his Revolutionary War buddy, and I was able to find their graves were side by side. So that was really exciting. And they fought together and were buried in the same location next to each other. So it's really, really stunning to me. Of course, having been at Mount Vernon and seen some of the archaeology going on there at the time, it's even more doubly exciting. But let me just show you the picture of these bottles that they're showing here. It's really stunning that cherries were found, I think. Absolutely incredible. God's divine providence was there during these battles, just like God's divine providence was with Elisha. And something in the heavenlies, God ordered these soldiers to see things that would strengthen their morale and lead them down the right path to accomplish their mission, so that our country would be saved and come into being the way that God wanted, so that the whole gospel message could go out to the world. I won't say that it was all good history by any means. Please don't think that. But, you know, it's really stunning how God intervenes, and when we least expect it, you know. God's divine presence can show up when we least expect it, and he can lead us and guide us in ways that we can't even see with our own eyes. So this is such incredible stories, and I just wanted to share them because I thought they were kind of exciting. So with that, I'll just say thank you for your support of my channel. And I'll put the donation links and the links to my book and everything down below in the description box. And I hope that you enjoyed these stories, and I will see you in the next episode. Please have a peaceful and beautiful evening, and I'll see you next time.